everyone. Welcome to the Wednesday, August 18th electronic meeting of the Ann Arbor Transportation Commission. This meeting is being held electronically to protect health and safety due to COVID-19. We will conduct this meeting similarly to an in-person meeting. Public comment will be via telephone only. To speak during any of the public comment opportunities, please call 206-337-9723 and enter meeting ID 938-5500-0747. Kayla, can you please call the roll?
Yes, we have received regrets from the following commissioners who are unable to join us this evening. Commissioner Hadamaki, Commissioner Balderrama, Commissioner Dolan, and Councilmember Bright. I will now call the roll. Please say here when your name is called. Commissioner Boland.
Here, participating remotely from Ann Arbor.
Commissioner Felt.
Here in Ann Arbor.
Commissioner Hull.
Here, participating remotely from Ann Arbor.
Commissioner Kleinman.
Here from Ann Arbor.
Commissioner Lee.
Here from Ann Arbor.
Commissioner Parsons.
Here from Ann Arbor.
Commissioner Smith. Commissioner Summers. Commissioner Summers. Oh, it looks like you're connecting to audio still. We are on you, Commissioner Summers, if your audio connection is complete. Oh, you're muted. You are muted. We'll mark you as present. We've got your verbal cue that you are here, and see if we can get you audio for the remainder of the meeting. Commissioner Hess.
Here in Ann Arbor.
Commissioner Hutchinson.
Here in Ann Arbor, Michigan.
Commissioner Margolis. Lieutenant Mike Sherba.
Here from Fenton, Michigan, and I'm not as sunburned as I look in the video, just saying.
Commissioner Stupka. And we do have, it looks like Commissioner Smith is here.
Yes, from Dexter.
Great, thank you. All right, we have a quorum.
Great, thank you. Are there any modifications to the consent agenda? All right, is there a motion to approve the consent agenda as presented? Commissioner Lee, can I get a second? Seconded by Boland. All those in favor of the motion, please physically raise your hand. All those opposed? Oh, and the abstentions? Commissioner Hall, was that in favor?
Yes, that was.
All right, great. So the consent agenda is approved. Moving on to public comment. This is an opportunity for members of the public to speak for up to 3 minutes. Please call 206-337-9723 and enter meeting ID number 938-5500-0747. City staff will select callers that have raised their hand by using the last 3 digits of your phone number. In order to raise your hand to indicate your desire to speak, please press *9 on your phone. You'll hear an automated announcement that the host is allowing you to speak. Do we have anyone for public comment today?
We do not.
Okay. As usual, if someone comes through a bit later, we can figure out how to make that work. Let's see. So next up, we have a presentation from Cynthia Redinger about the annual crash report.
And I know Cynthia was having a little trouble connecting. So Cynthia, let us know if you are all set up now. And I think if not, we could be flexible. I'll offer this, if Raymond is open to it, to swap the order and have Raymond present on advisory bike lanes if Cynthia is still having trouble connecting.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that.
Okay. Is that okay with the commission? Are there any of, I guess I should ask the chair to.
I think swapping the order is fine. Yeah. All right, so we are good to go. We're going to get a presentation from Raymond Hess on advisory bike lanes.
All right. Thank you, Madam Chair and Commission members. So at your request, there was some discussion about a desire to talk about advisory bike lanes. They are kind of popping up around town. So I wanted to walk you through kind of a sort of imagination exercise, and then we'll get into a little bit more depth. So what I wanted to do is start off by take for a moment and imagine a local neighborhood street in Ann Arbor. And if you can't imagine one, you can look at the one on screen. And so if you think about what the characteristics of that road might be, typically they're fairly narrow. They're about 30 feet wide. Many streets, many residential streets, local streets in Ann Arbor, kind of that profile. They may allow for parking on one side of the street or maybe even both sides of the street. The one that you see before you is on one side of the street. And so if you think about how a motorist behaves on this street, typically, and this is my observation on my street, cars tend to kind of drive in the middle of the road. Just because cars are parked, there might be other things going on. And that's just kind of the natural behavior that you witness on our local neighborhood streets, because they are narrow, and kind of driving in the center makes a lot more sense than kind of dodging in and out of parked cars and what have you. That's not recommended, right? So what happens though when there's an oncoming car? Well, I'm sure you've all played this game where you kind of do the courteous thing and you shift over a little bit to let the oncoming car pass by if there isn't enough room for both cars to pass. Or if there is enough room for both cars to pass, you probably shift a little further away from the center and closer to, the right side of the road than perhaps you were doing before. So again, this plays out, every day on every residential street throughout town. Well, what if there's a cyclist? A similar situation, typically cyclists ride, to the right, and a car will yield and then overtake the cyclist by crossing over an imaginary center line. Most of our residential roads don't have any pavement markings, similar to what you see in this picture before you. So they would just kind of pass the cyclist, crossing over an imaginary center line. Well, again, what if there's a car there? What would happen? So typically that car would have to yield behind the bicyclist, allow for the car to pass. And then once the oncoming car has passed, then the other car can overtake the cyclist and pass that cyclist safely by, again, kind of crossing over that imaginary center line. So I wanted to go through this kind of theoretical exercise just because what advisory bike lanes do is they help clarify all of those maneuvers by just adding some paint on the road. It's relatively low-cost treatment. So you take a situation like you have here, which is a local residential street, fairly narrow, parking on one side of the street, and you turn it into something that looks like this. And this is Granger that you see before you, a before and after. These were installed, I believe, last fall or last year sometime. And so you can see how kind of all those scenarios that I just played out work. The car would drive kind of in the center of the road. Bicyclists would be in these dashed bike lanes. If a vehicle comes upon a cyclist, it would pass the cyclist around using kind of the center of the road, but would yield if there's an oncoming vehicle. So with that in mind, that was a very hokey demonstration of a advisory bike lane. Now let's do a more professional one, not produced by me, but produced by our friendly neighbors to the north. So bear with me for a second. I'm going to stop sharing and then share a different screen. All right, and Kayla and I tested this before, so in theory, audio will work. If it does not, please holler.
Ottawa is about to be one of the first cities in Canada with advisory cycling lanes. Popular in Europe and in the US, the system is great for adding cycling lanes to streets where they wouldn't otherwise fit, narrow roads with low volume traffic and low speed. Here's how they work. Traffic from both sides share one center lane. Cycling lanes are placed on each side of the road. When there are two drivers traveling in opposite directions, the vehicles move into the cycling lane to pass each other's space. What happens if there's a bike in the cycling lane? Whoever is in front has the right of way. Vehicles travel behind the bike, but can then move back into the center lane when it is safe to do so. It is a whole new way for drivers and cyclists to share the road. Find out more at ottawa.ca.
See, much better in terms of professional presentation there, except they spelled center, C-E-N-T-R-E. Isn't that cute? So now let's go back to the presentation. All right. Has the presentation come back up? Very good. All right, so now to get into a little technical mumbo jumbo and planeries and transportationese. Advisory bike lanes are defined as a single center lane which supports two-way motor vehicle travel and an edge lane on either side, preferentially reserved for one-way use by vulnerable road users such as cyclists. These are sometimes called edge lane roads or advisory shoulders as well. And typically where these are used are lower posted speed limit streets. So as all of you, I think, know and appreciate, our local residential streets are 25 miles per hour, whether or not it's posted. So, you know, that's what they are, and that's why this application would make sense. Lower volume streets are also another characteristic of this. You know, you wouldn't want to put this necessarily on a very high volume style like Plymouth type road. But you know, our local neighborhood streets are definitely below that 6,000 daily traffic threshold. They tend to also be shorter segments, or they provide an important connection. A lot of the implementations in North America tend to be less than a mile long. There are some exceptions to that rule, but for the most part, they're really seen as kind of a connection piece as opposed to a full-blown facility type. And then the other last characteristic is typically on narrower streets. And the reason why this is appropriate on narrow streets is if you have a wider street, then you would actually look at putting in full-blown bike lanes, buffered, protected, or otherwise, or just plain bike lanes. But 30 feet allows for, you know, if it's less than 30 feet, you can't really squeeze in the two 10-foot bicycle lanes and two 5-foot bike lanes. And, you know, in the instance that I showed you earlier, when there's on-street parking, that on-street parking kind of encroaches into that 30 feet. And you don't really have enough room to accommodate all of those different things at the same time. So some of the benefits, and the benefits that I cite are taken from a journal article. So I will provide you the link at the end. It's also very small print at the top as a credit. So if you want to look up these resources, you can do so. But there was a study of 6 North American deployments, and what they found was that generally advisory bike lanes reduce or there's no noticeable change in crash rate. So it's either positive or you know, no change. Same thing with motor vehicle speeds. Same thing with motor vehicle volume. Among the 6 cities studied, there was mixed results in terms of bicycle volume changes, whether they actually attracted more riders or if the same number of people were using it or not. So, you know, the jury is still out on that one. The second to last bullet, that the study found that they operate as intended. And I really want to underscore this point as well, because there seems to be a lot of concern that these advisory bike lanes will lead to a lot of head-on collisions among motorists, that they're traveling in the middle of the lane, they think it's a one-way road, and when they approach another oncoming vehicle, that they just run into that vehicle. There's no evidence to suggest that that's actually happening. Actually, there have been no documented head-on collisions, at least in this study, and this was from 2019, as a result of advisory bike lanes. And quite frankly, it seems to be having the intended effect of, you know, bringing awareness to the possible presence of cyclists on these residential streets. And so it is, the documentation, the studies seem to suggest that these are beneficial in operating in a way that you would expect people to operate on them. And then the last thing I wanted to highlight is they are relatively low cost. It is just paint on the street, dashed lines. That's not to say that doesn't cost nothing. It does cost something indeed, but it's relatively inexpensive, and they can be accommodated and retrofitted into existing roadways pretty readily. So now what I wanted to do is just give you a quick snapshot of some of the deployments that exist here in Ann Arbor. Summit between Beeks and Fifth was installed shortly after the opening of the Allen Creek Berm tunnel. And the reason why that was put in is because it provides that connection to the Allen Creek Berm opening between Beeks and Fifth. And then it also, you have Wheeler Park and some other attractions there. So providing that connection seemed like an important one for cyclists. The next one was the one we kind of just talked about, which is Granger between State and Packard. You know, this is a residential street kind of immediately adjacent to the campus. I'm sure all of you are aware of this. It also connects the bike facilities on State and Packard. So it's an important connection between those facilities and those destinations. The two newest ones, first up is William, west of First. This extends the people-friendly streets to the west. So, you know, I think many of you are familiar with the cycle track on William. When that was finished up a couple years ago, there was always an intent to extend the facility further to the west. But again, the characteristic of the road changes, and so does the bike facility in return. So it transitions from that, you know, buffered and protected bike cycle track into this facility, the advisory bike lanes. Gets you kind of deeper into the neighborhood because, again, traffic volumes are slower, traffic volumes are down through this section. And then right around the corner from it is First Street, south of William. This one, you know, paint is still drying on it. South of William, it extends the people-friendly streets to the south. Similar situation as William, where, you know, you have the new cycle track on First Street that gets you all the way down to William. So you make that critical connection on cycle tracks between William and First. But then as you extend south on First, you know, to Washtenaw Dairy, there's still an interest in connecting and providing a bike facility. But because of on-street parking, because of the two-way configuration, because things are a little bit different on this part of the roadway, it made sense to apply an advisory bike lane. And that pretty much concludes the presentation. What I did want to provide you with are some of the resources. So we do have a web page dedicated to this if you've seen it. You can access it from the engineering department or our transportation page. It gives the video from Ottawa that I showed you earlier, as well as a couple quick high-level bullet points about what advisory bike lanes are. I think there's also some mention about bike boxes in there as well. The ITE journal that I cited is there, and then there's a much longer white paper from Alta Planning and Design that goes into a little bit more depth about some of the benefits as well, if you really want to get geeky and read up on that stuff. So with that, I would be happy to entertain any questions you might have.
Great. Thank you, Raymond. I'm going to ask people to use the raise hand function in Zoom, and I'll call on you in the order that those come up. So I see Commissioner Felt.
My main question and concern is that the advisory bike lanes put bikes precisely in the most dangerous part of the road, which is in the door zone. And so that's how these advisory bike lanes have fundamentally never made sense to me. I'm wondering if you would address that question.
Yeah, there is some literature. I did look into this. So a couple things. You know, if looking at Granger, for example, you're correct to point out that the let's see, the advisory bike lane, I guess that would be on the south side of the road, is adjacent to the parked cars, whereas the advisory bike lane on the north side of Granger, there are no parked cars. So it's kind of 50-50 in that situation. You are correct that cyclists should definitely be wary of that door zone in any situation, whether it's advisory bike lane, regular bike lane, or otherwise. I have seen some applications whereby you can actually paint a buffer between the parked vehicles, then a buffer, and then the advisory bike lane, with the same kind of idea that you are buffering the bicycles from those parked cars. You might be shifting the vehicles a little further into that center of the road situation, or even maybe condensing that center lane to a certain extent to address that. And then, you know, that provides kind of that opportunity and that protection. My understanding is that Granger does have a slight buffer between the T's and the bike lane. So one of the things that, you know, when Granger was done, Before, again, if you look at that previous picture, there were no parking delineation T's, and so those have been added. And you know that let's see if we can pull up that picture. There is a let me see. I'm going to share my screen again. That's okay. All right, so again, this is Granger, and you can see that where
Have your screen right.
Oh, I'm sorry. I have to hit the actual share button. That's always helpful. All right, did it come up now, hopefully?
Yes, thank you.
All right, so you'll see, Commissioner felt that, you know, this line of parked cars has these parking T's, which, you know, are a little hard to see, but you kind of see these little markings. And then there's a couple of feet buffer between that and the line of the advisory bike lane. So there is a slight buffer that's provided there. Looks, if I had to eyeball it, looks maybe about 2 feet. I don't know if Cynthia can give me a thumbs up on that or not, but so we did try to be mindful of that on Granger and provide a little bit of buffer from that door zone and the advisory bike lane.
Commissioner Lee and then Commissioner Parsons.
Thanks. I think this looks great. What are the evaluative criteria of like feedback? And so what I mean is there kind of like data collection on utilization, reduction in speed, and what are you looking for? Obviously it's kind of a low cost measure, but do we have a formalized method of saying, is this successful in encouraging additional cyclists, and what's the utilization / public sentiment? So can you speak to kind of what of a system of feedback you might have?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, admittedly, these are new to us and we're still getting used to them and figuring out how to message them correctly. Admittedly, we could have done a much better job on the rollout of the Summit advisory bike lane. You know, that was kind of a decision that was made as we were out there getting ready for the Allen Creek berm opening, and we saw an opportunity and we kind of pounced on it without doing as much outreach as we should have. So that was definitely a misstep on our part. Our observation is that the Granger deployment has gone a little bit smoother, and part of the reason for that is we did socialize the idea of the advisory bike lane as part of that resurfacing project. So there were public engagement opportunities. We vetted this idea publicly. We got the neighborhood to kind of understand what it was. And, you know, hopefully some of them have bought into the idea and were supportive of it. In terms of, you know, what kind of data collection we do, typically we like to let things settle for a little bit. We like to let things normalize to make sure people kind of get used to it before we kind of go out and try to collect too much data when it's too fresh, because, you know, travel behaviors may still be acclimating to the new facility and what have you. You know, admittedly, we haven't devised an exact campaign for how we'll assess these, but typically what we would do is we do bicycle pedestrian counts at various locations throughout the city on an annual basis. And typically we'll focus on new facilities or do a baseline count before a new facility comes out. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if in the next year or so we collect data on bicycle usage on Granger as well as Summit. That might be one opportunity. In terms of receiving public feedback, you know, we kind of receive that on a regular basis. If people are satisfied or unsatisfied with a facility, we just kind of take those calls, take those emails. We weren't planning on doing like a public survey or anything like that, like a post-implementation survey. Typically what we do is we just kind of see what the, you know, the buzz is on the street. And then if there are modifications that are warranted, if, you know, some of the things that we're hearing need to be addressed right immediately, we try to go out there and do that. And you know, we've gotten some positive comments on these deployments. We've gotten some who are opposed to them. But we also, I should also note, and maybe Cynthia can correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of the opposition has kind of died down recently related to Summit and Granger. I should notice that. Now, obviously with the new ones that have gone in on First and William, that has attracted new attention kind of on that side of town. But again, that's just because it's change and it's a new facility, and I think people are kind of reacting to that change. So I know that's probably not the best succinct answer in terms of how we're going to assess the success of these. But we obviously also look at crash data. We want to make sure that there aren't any negative trends that are happening in terms of like increases of crashes and things like that. So that's kind of how we would approach it on these.
Gotcha. Well, thank you. Having that dialogue, I think, is important to just think about how do we measure this? What are the criteria, values of criteria? So, but overall, again, change takes time, getting used to it. So I personally like it. So thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I had that same question. So next up is Commissioner Parsons.
Raymond, thanks for the presentation. As always, first comment is just anecdotal, and Granger is the section that I'm most familiar with. That's where I bike or drive often. And personally, I think it's as transformative as the Packard bike lane was. I just see more kids on the sidewalks. I see cars driving a lot slower. Everything feels safe. I know that there was a lot of initial reaction against it, including from people in sort of my circles who questioned why that was happening. But I think, as all things, it takes some time getting used to, and I think people are getting used to it. The other thing I want to say is that while the website does a great job of showing you how to navigate those spaces, it doesn't really explain the why. And that's what I would encourage including to the webpage for the city. A lot of the feedback that I've heard is people asking, why are these here and what does it mean? And why is Ann Arbor experimenting on the road in these crazy ways that no one has ever done before? So I think some historical context would be really useful, that these are used in the United States. They're extensively used in Europe, but Minneapolis, I believe, was the first to do this. And this was like 15 years ago for Minneapolis. Portland followed 10 years ago. Boulder, the usual names. But you also have Chicago, Indiana, and even Grand Rapids. Like, this is not new to the field. This is best practice right now. So it takes some adjustment in Ann Arbor, but it's not like we're just willy-nilly experimenting. And I think that's useful to put on the website, as well as where they're installed. I hear a lot of people saying, like, are we going to turn all of our roads into this? Like, no, these are small segments that are important for connections. And once you see how that plays out, they're really important connections. I think this is a brilliant treatment to connect when you have cycle track connecting to bike lane and you have, less than a mile, sometimes just a block to connect. These are great treatments to do that. Final thing I'll say is that I think I saw a study, and let me look again. I don't have access to it right now, but it was an 8-year study of 11 installations, and they found a 44% reduction in vehicle crash rate and no reported pedestrian or bicycle crashes. Let me try to find that. It was buried deep somewhere. That might be useful, but I think the more data and explanation and context that we can give people up front is going to make these a lot more palatable for those who are questioning the sort of why as opposed to the how. So I love this effort. I think staff should continue doing this, and thanks for what you do.
Thanks for the suggestions.
Thank you. Sorry, one sec. Pause, please, Helena. Any other questions or comments? All right, great. Thank you so much, Raymond. And we are going to move on. It looks like we've got Cynthia Redinger here functioning now. So we're going to go back to the start and get a presentation on the annual crash report.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for your flexibility. My name is Cynthia Redinger. I am one of the city's transportation engineers, and this evening I have the privilege of sharing some annual crash data with you. And Kayla, if you could confirm that we're sharing okay? Great.
We are seeing the first slide. Thank you.
Thank you. I am definitely interested in confirming that because I had some difficulties this evening. All right, so this evening we're going to talk about crash data from the time frame of 2011 through 2020. This is draft crash data. I'm calling it draft crash data because it's not in its final format, and it is a sampling of data for the annual crash report. I want to stress that it's a sampling because, as always, I need to limit how much I'm talking about, or we would be here until midnight. Tonight, I just want to touch on the purpose of the annual crash report, what the sources of our data is, an overview of some of the trends, and have time for discussion and questions. So the annual crash report is, it's a report that we in engineering produce for the Transportation Commission. It's an opportunity for you to see what trends are happening in our crash data. We produce this report annually, and we anticipate that this year the report will be finalized prior to and for your October commission meeting. So a little bit on the data sources. So the data used in this report comes from the Michigan certified, I apologize for that. The Michigan certified crash data. Usually we access this data via RoadSoft, and this year the Michigan State Police has invested in a new way to share their data with the agencies in the state, and that is the new metric platform. And I'll be sharing a lot of information from the new metric platform this evening. So these data are available for viewing by the public through the Office of Highway Safety Planning's online data tool, which is michigantrafficcrashfacts.org. Southeast Michigan Council of Governments also has traffic crash maps that are available through their map gallery at semcog.org, and the city's own crash map, which is available on our website through the maps. And a reminder, as always, that I filter the data to remove crashes that occurred on the freeway system or on private property, and animal crashes are generally not included in these tips. A note on Vision Zero engineering. This is one of those things that we talk about every year, but what is it? It's engineering practice that acknowledges human error and strives to prevent death and serious injury, also referred to as KSI crashes, instead of reacting to specific events. And the how is using data to identify trends, apply proven design elements, and address high crash locations. And another note on 5-year averages. For those of you who haven't seen this data before, while we look at what happens on an annual basis, we always also use rolling 5-year averages to understand what the trend is going like. And the rolling 5-year average is an industry standard. It helps to smooth out short-term fluctuations in the data and really see what trends are going on. So I'm presenting the data a little bit different this year. I am hoping that this makes the data a little bit more relatable. So we're going to be looking at who crashed first. And some of this is in response to some questions that I've had from the commission in the past. So when we're looking at who crashed, one of the things that is commonly looked at is gender. And I do want to note that gender in this case is identified at, per the Office of Highway Safety Planning and the Michigan State Police through the UD10 crash data. So the UD10 currently only acknowledges masculine and feminine as gender. And it's interesting when looking at how you're going to be targeting different efforts such as communications and education efforts. And since we do have budget for that this year, I thought it would be interesting to look at. For all of our crashes, we do have very few are unknown over the 10-year period. And they're the total data set, it's fairly balanced with a slightly higher percentage in it happening with male drivers. But then when you look at our KSI crashes, there's definitely more skewed towards male drivers. That is it is consistent with national trends. Something else that it has been an interest in the past is looking at driver age, and with the new tools that MSP has available, it's a little bit easier it's much easier to see what the age of drivers are. So for all crashes, you can see that we do have a clustering in that 25 and under age bracket, and then a little bit more of a steady sort of rate between 30 and 59, and then it tapers off after age 60 and above. This is really interesting when you compare it to what we see with the driver age for our KSI crashes. And I do want to point out that these charts involve a pedestrian or a bicyclist if they are one of the parties to the crash. It's not just drivers, and also engineers, although we don't have any train crashes in our data set. So once again, you have that under 25, you have a little bit of a spike. The percentage in those two age brackets for, up to 20 and 21 to 24 is a little bit different than with the overall crash pattern. Following a similar trend, but what's really interesting is once you get to age 80 and above, you do have an uptick in the amount of involvement in KSI crashes. And this could be attributable to the fact that just human physiology, as a more mature individual, your resiliency to injury does start to decline. But it is an interesting thing to see. And this is just a comparison, so you can see the comparison between those two crash data sets. Something that we've been asked about in the past is what our demographics for individuals who are involved in crashes are. And this is the data I was able to pull, both for the all crashes and the KSI data set. It's exceptionally limited. There is there's just not really much data here. But I did want to let you know that it is starting to be collected, and hopefully as we move forward in time, we'll have more of this data available to us. Next, I wanted to look at where they crashed. So where these crashes happen. And this set of maps, these are all of the crashes as reported by the New Metrics site. So I wanted to show you this just so that you can see that there are a couple of outlier crashes. I'm still learning this tool a little bit more and learning how to fine tune it so that I'm getting the exact same data set that I have with RoadSoft. But it's an exciting tool to have available to us. We will be providing in the report the crash maps that you're used to seeing over the last several years that are produced by our GIS staff. And they will be the 5-year maps as they have been in the past. They're going to look very similar to the maps that have been in the last couple of reports, as we haven't had significant changes in locations. A tool that is really helpful that we have available to us through the New Metrics site is this crash by street type. As you can see, for the all crashes and the KSI crashes, the majority of the crashes in the city are happening on city jurisdiction streets. And, the interstate business route and the US business route, so that's going to be the MDOT jurisdiction roadways, your crashes that are happening on North Main or on Washtenaw, Huron, Jackson corridor. Something that I think is really interesting that I was able to pull from the MSP data now is the crashes by speed limit, and it being very easy to pull this data. Now, I want to point out to everyone that the columns are not in ascending order for speed limits, but they are in ascending order or descending order of frequency. So the speed limit is at the bottom here. So the majority of all of our crashes are happening on those 35 mile per hour corridors, which is consistent with the information that came out of the transportation study and where those tier 1 and tier 2 corridors are, followed by 25 and then 30 and then the 45 and 40 mile per hour. When you compare this to our KSI crashes, you find similar trends. So this just reinforces what we already knew, and that is that we need to be looking at engineering tools to manage speed on corridors and be able to look for those opportunities to reduce operating speeds. So the next thing I wanted to look at is, when did they crash? So these are the temporal analyses that we've seen over the last several years that have been included in the crash report. Crashes by month of year, day of week, and time of day. They're pretty steady with what they've been over the years. They are also consistent with what one would expect from national standards. Looking at our KSI crashes, we do see, some of those shifts, especially the shifts in the month of the year where the majority of our crashes are happening, that concentration in those more active summer, warm weather months. And also the differences in crashes that happen on time of day, but consistent with what we've seen over the last couple of years. Why did they crash? So this is something that the commission has had lots of questions about in the past, and there are some new tools that I wanted to share with everyone. And that's some of these tools are, it's just easier to pull this data together now. And this is our attributes and severity for all of our crashes. So in the column, you have from zero entry up to fatality, and then what are these attributes to the crash that are happening. So for all of our crashes, we have this high clustering in our young driver category and in our intersection category, and then also our elderly driver category. And for your information, the young driver category is everyone under the age of 25. And so that includes what are assumed to be more novice drivers and drivers who are finishing up adolescence and getting developmentally to that point where they're in a post-adolescent state. When we look at our KSI crashes, we see that we also have a lot of a clustering with intersection and young driver crashes, although they are reversed from the overall crash pattern. And then pedestrian being the next significant attribute, and then alcohol involved, and then elderly, and then bicycle, and then drug involved. So those are pretty consistent with the target behaviors that were reported in the transportation plan. The hazardous actions, which are also reported on in the transportation plan for all crashes, as you can see, we have, the unable to stop, assured clear vision. So failure to yield, and then, speed too fast, some improper driving, and then getting into careless driving and reckless driving and those sorts of things. But then when we look at our KSI crashes, speed is too fast, unable to stop, assured clear distance, you drove left to center line, but then reckless driving, careless driving, disregard for traffic control devices, and improper lane use. Also consistent with what was reported in the transportation plan. Something that I wanted to provide a little bit of a deeper dive in tonight, and there will be more information on this in the final report, but is pedestrians. Pedestrians are always of great interest for the commission. And I wanted to point out the overall crash occurrence for 2020, and the fact that it is overall crashes are down significantly. But our severe injury crashes have not had that strong reduction. And starting to look at the whys behind that. 2020, we did have a good period of the year where we were not driving as much. But what I found really, really striking as I was looking at this data is looking at when we as a city decided to install the leading pedestrian intervals as part of our COVID response. And we decided to install them blanket, citywide, everywhere. And I'm saying the end of May. I think it might have been a little bit earlier than that. But the difference in crashes in the before LPIs and the after LPIs has me tentatively excited. But we'll have to see if that's a blip or a trend. So I'm happy to take questions. I would also like to remind everyone that when the crash report gets produced, all of the tables that you've seen previously will also be in this year's version of the crash report. And then we will be looking as part of our implementation strategy for Vision Zero and working with the consultant that gets selected for that process to determine what this report will look like as we move forward. So questions?
Thank you so much. That was great. I always love getting the crash report every year. So let's start with Commissioner Felt.
Thank you. Yes, I think it's also a fascinating document. And I read every page of it. And I have two questions. The speeding too fast section in the report, I was struck by that language, and I wonder if that is language from the police records or where that comes from. Because I think as far as changing culture, particularly around the issue of speeding, that really does a disservice, as if they're speeding just enough or speeding too slow. And so I also wonder if that can be changed either in the report soon or if it needs to be changed at the state level in some way. But I think that that's a very odd term and does not serve our purpose well at all. My other question is more simple, which is simply that the report clearly states that while we expect the problems with younger drivers to be decreasing, we are going to have more and more older drivers. And I think that that might be a really appropriate topic for a future transportation commission. I don't recall that we addressed that in the transportation plan specifically. So I may not be remembering correctly, but so what are the plans around that issue that you identified in the report? That's it. Thanks.
I can speak to the designation. So the speeding too fast for conditions, it is as part of the UD10.
So can anything be done about that? As far as trying to move us culturally to any kind of speeding is a problem?
The too fast for conditions could refer to someone who is traveling below the speed limit, but too fast for the environmental conditions. So they're kind of lumped together. So it's like speeding in excess of the speed limit, or you're traveling too fast to be operating successfully in the conditions of the road. So I think icy conditions or snow, water covering the roadway kind of things.
So even putting it into the report by putting the full title would be helpful.
Yeah.
But I'll just bring that up as a point that I hope that we can change that eventually, which is and all speeding. Maybe there needs to be two categories, one of which is just speeding beyond the speed limit, and the other is speeding too fast for conditions. I know earlier on in the CPI, we broke it up in a way that became clearer in that way. And as far as the elderly stuff goes,
yeah, Commissioner Fell, can you repeat that question? I was pulling up the plan itself and lost
what
my
we're
train of
doing to
thought.
address what was identified as a growing, a sure to increase problem with elderly drivers who that's going up rather rapidly.
Yeah, what I might have to do is I might have to, nothing comes to my mind specifically about elderly drivers. I know when we talk about like all ages and all abilities, like bike network, things like that, that is kind of assumed in that. But in terms of elderly drivers, nothing is coming to mind, but let me do a deeper dive into the transportation plan and then follow up with the commission on that one.
Yeah, and supportive services, which basically get old people out of cars and into alternative transportation where everybody will be safer. That's the most obvious transportation resolution, but it could be a future topic for a meeting.
I had a question related to that actually that I'm going to throw in now while we're talking about it, which was, it sounded like you were saying that for the driver age and for driver race, what those actually are anyone involved in the crash, like the age of everyone involved in the crash, regardless of whether they're the driver or the victim. And I think it would be really valuable to have that broken out, because maybe the issue is that we have more elderly people who are not driving, who are walking, and who are slower crossing the street, and unless we have that breakout, we can't know if it's that they're driving and crashing more or they're victims more. And so if it's possible to break that out, I think it would be very valuable both for age and for race. And I know the race data was a little disappointing, but I still think it would be really important to have. Sorry, Lynn, Commissioner Feltz, I jumped in on that. Did you have more that you wanted to? Okay, great. Next up is Commissioner Parsons.
Just quick, I want to echo what Molly just commented with. I think it's really important to understand the context of what's going on when we talk about age and particularly race and try to figure that out. So if there's a breakdown that we can do with that would be fantastic, which is a segue to my next one, which is the sort of deeper dive that might need to happen still. I love these tools that you have now. And Cynthia, thank you so much for the presentation. And I'm so excited about where data analysis is going. And I encourage you to keep doing it. It's really encouraging. What we learned when staff did a deeper dive last year for pedestrian crashes is that the majority of these things, majority of these crashes happened with turning movements of vehicles with pedestrians in a crosswalk. So it's not necessarily the where, it's the how. And I don't know if the current data categories allow us to investigate the how without doing sort of deeper dive. So I guess the first question is staff prepared potentially to do a deeper dive and understand how some of these crashes occur, not necessarily the where. Second thing to note is that in the hazard action section that was identified in police reports, none was the overwhelming number that came up, which to me speaks to how dangerous our roads are in the status quo. That's really scary. If there's no error going on and there's nothing that people are doing wrong, why are we having these devastating crashes all the time? And so maybe, to extrapolate, obviously Vision Zero is trying to address that, but it seems to me that is really important. The other thing that might play into this, and I think it was in the same slide that was with young driver and elderly driver, was intersection crashes. Intersection crashes are an engineering problem. They're not a cultural problem necessarily. I mean, certainly cultural issues come into play, but it's the engineering aspect that we might be able to focus on to try to mitigate some of these intersection crashes. So anyway, that's sort of a long-winded thing, and maybe you can pick out some things to answer or comment to. But thank you again.
I think the first thing I'd like to talk about is that kind of deeper dive into the pedestrian crashes. And I had hoped to have that replicated for this meeting, and I did not get it finalized before the meeting. So that is information that will be part of the report as a follow-up, particularly as I'm interested in seeing how that the LPI has affected those crashes that are happening at intersections, but are, I would say that they are, partly behavioral, where a pedestrian was in conflict with either a permissive left or a permissive right turn, and we noticed that pattern where it was from behind the pedestrian. As the pedestrian and the vehicle start in that same plane of movement, and then the permissive turn happens. And so I'm really interested in seeing how that LPI is affecting that particular crash pattern, and hopefully we'll see that a lot of that has been resolved. And if there's anything else specifically that you want me to speak to Commissioner Parsons, please ping me on that. It was kind of a lot in there. And what I think that, when we're looking at like really deep dives on crashes, it's either we need to be looking at a specific crash type that we're focusing on right now, or it's like a location, if we're looking at one of our target locations and we're designing a set of countermeasures for that, then we're really that's when we're really seriously digging into the nitty gritty of every single crash. I see that that Raymond has something to add, as well as Lieutenant Sherba.
Sherba first, so why don't we go in that order?
Cynthia, quick question. Does the crash data include all crashes in the city or only UD10 crashes?
So as the certified data set, these are all of the crashes that a UD10 has been produced for. I do exclude crashes that happen on private property. So, and I think we've had that discussion in the past of, are we really catching everything with the UD10s? And I think that with the majority of things we are. I know that there are some, and you can probably speak to this a little bit better, but in the past, it's been my understanding that a lot of those those private property crashes are ones that don't get UD10s.
Okay, the reason I was asking, because I think I can maybe speak to Commissioner Parsons' question about the none for the hazardous action. When a crash occurs, the officer goes out and assesses the incident, and if it's deemed what we call a local crash or a private property crash, it does not go on a UD10. And as you're probably aware, $1,000 is the threshold for mandatory UD10 reporting. So a minor fender bender, anything that looks to be under $1,000 will go on this local crash. And per our policy, we do not assign fault to we don't assign a hazardous action to private property or to local crashes. So that being the case, I think that's why you're seeing so many that come in that show none as a hazardous action, when in fact there was a hazardous action. And I would argue that there's a hazardous action in every crash, whether or not it's a violation of motor vehicle code or poor judgment or lack of right of way or anything like that. But there's always a hazardous action. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a crash. Does that help to answer your question?
Sorry, trying to figure out how to unmute. That is super helpful. Thank you. And if we could separate those out a little bit, that might be helpful. But that is very helpful. But I'm most interested in situations where just normal driving behavior. One of the Vision Zero tenets is that accidents are going to happen. And it's not necessarily that people are malicious in what they do or negligent in what they do. They just make a mistake. It's distracted, or it's, driving a little bit too fast, whatever happens to be for the road conditions, right? So where are the normal operating conditions that cause a lot of crashes? And I understand that the data collection reduces that number that we were talking about before, and I definitely do appreciate that. But it's those instances, for instance, in intersections. Why are intersections so high? Obviously, they're conflict zones. Okay, well, how many people are injured there? At what rate? What are the ages? What are the injury rates and all that kind of thing? I feel like I've spoken a lot, but I very much appreciate the deeper analysis and explanation.
Of course.
Commissioner Hess.
Yeah, and I just wanted to circle back to the question that Commissioner Felt raised about elderly drivers. I didn't find anything in the plan specifically speaking to that. There is some language in the All Ages and All Abilities bike network. But the thing that I failed to mention is Key Strategy 18 talked about the 20-minute neighborhood, which, as a reminder, ensures that all residents have access to basic daily needs within a 20-minute walk. And there's some language in there that says a 20-minute neighborhood also enables older adults to age in place so that losing access to a vehicle does not result in losing independence, which then goes to Commissioner Kleinman's point about whether, those crashes were, elderly persons who were involved in the crash who were walking or whether they were driving. So I think, that's something Cynthia and I can brainstorm to see if that's possible to tease that out. If you've never seen a UD10, how, the people involved in the crash are categorized. There's kind of, party one, party two, and, vehicle one, and all that. So I don't know if it's always readily apparent, like, who's at fault per se. So, that I don't know if we'll be able to tease some of that out, but I think, whether the person was the driver or the pedestrian, we might be able to suss that out a little bit.
Great, thank you. I'm not seeing other hands, so I'm going to dive into my list of questions and feedback. And if other folks have stuff they want to jump in with, just, raise your hand. I thought this was really helpful. As always, I'm really looking forward to seeing the final report. A few notes, given that you're using this new tool, and so some of the stuff is unfamiliar. For those pie charts, including the percentages would be really helpful. Like, you can sort of see visually, but it's just really nice to have the numbers there. I already mentioned that having that distinction between the driver versus the pedestrian. For the crash maps, those heat maps, which are so, like, they're just, I feel like they give such an easy to see and understand view of where the crashes are happening. I think it'd be really helpful. I was looking at last year's crash map not that long ago. And there's not one that's just sort of focused on downtown and maybe even like zoomed in a little bit on downtown. And I think because downtown is, like, the whole downtown is such a hot zone for crashes, I think it'd be really great if we could maybe get a little bit more detail in a downtown, like a downtown specific map. I've been hearing chatter about things like whether it would make sense to get rid of right on red downtown and other ways, because there's so much pedestrian traffic and bike traffic downtown. So I think having that as something new maybe would be really valuable. I understand why major highways, the like sort of ring roads, are removed from this report, but I know we do these sort of like these focus deeper dives every year. And given all of the issues we've had on M14 with the truck crashes, I'm wondering whether, if you have that data available, whether that might be something worth looking at, because it has a lot of knock-on effects into that whole section of the city. I don't live up there, so I can't speak to it directly, but I've heard a lot about that as one potential thing to zoom in on. Oh, and then just one thing, it's really cool to see what a difference the LPIs have made, but I've noticed that some of them have gone away, and I miss them down, especially at Eisenhower. There, I like there's a couple of them that are gone, and maybe that's just an error, but I've been wondering whether they're getting phased out or whether we were planning to keep those. All right. Well, so then I'll send a little C-click fix about those.
Yeah, and
Eisenhower and I was
Go
going to
ahead,
say
Cynthia.
Eisenhower and where?
King George and Stone School. I can't remember. One of them, the issue is just that the green is so short crossing Eisenhower that you can't get across. And one of them, the LPI was gone. And I can't remember if it was which one was which or both, but those are two places where I personally am crossing Eisenhower a lot, not in a car. So I've noticed those ones. But I think those are all my notes. I was all comments and no questions from me this time, but as usual, I really appreciate all of your work on this. I think it's really valuable. And I see Commissioner Lee has something.
Yeah, I'll make it pretty brief. Really cool report. And I think some site-specific, discussions like maybe that Carpenter, or it's not Carpenter, but Washtenaw, and I think Carpenter is like a pretty big intersection for crashes, would be probably the next kind of deeper dive in terms of site-specific. I have a question on just like cars. Just kind of personally curious about whether technology makes it safer or not. So if we collect like VIN numbers for specific cars and crashes, do the lane assists like make it safer for us, or does it lend itself to greater? I imagine there's car companies like Tesla collecting all of this data anyways, but I just wonder, is there a direct correlation with more cars with lane assist capabilities that make it, less likely? I see a lot of crashes are related to lane assist. So it's kind of like the, football helmet, you design them safer and they hit harder kind of thing. So, is technology and technological innovation and car safety making us indeed safer? So that was just a question I had. I mean, do we collect VIN data, and is it possible to correlate some of these with the technological capabilities that cars have? Just an interesting question. I don't know if it's necessarily relevant to policy decision-making per se, but just a thought I throw out there to see if that's a collection point. And then the other thing actually that I did want to ask is I know we worked on some ordinances regulating the motorized scooters in terms of like speed and things of that nature. Are the crashes significant enough to measure that? Potentially, I can't see them being, worthy of causing $1,000 worth of damage or anything like that. But do we have enough significant incidences of, crashes where as they become more prevalent in a community? Is that something that we should or should not collect? And I guess I'm asking more anecdotally. Are we going to be collecting that moving forward? Is it even important? So the first question was just on technology. Maybe is it making us safer? And then number two would be, are there motorized but kind of more condensed scooters that create potentially more crash incidents, and are they significant enough to even collect data on?
As far as the technology component goes, vehicle data does get collected as part of the UD10. I do not have access to that. The data that I work with is sanitized. So I have 0 personal identifiers in the data that I'm working with, which is as it should be. But what I can say is that there are other entities who are working on this, and something that the Ann Arbor Police Department and our transportation department participates in is some of that research that is going on at U of M through their International Center for Automotive Medicine. And so that there are folks who are working on that, but it's not necessarily me. I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that, Lieutenant Sherba, but as far as scooters go, currently the UD10 does not have it doesn't have a category for scooters, and that's something that it has been discussed, at at multiple levels, with the state, and that there are a lot of jurisdictions in the state who are interested in starting to collect that data. But currently the guidance is to, please correct me if I'm wrong, but currently the guidance is to count a scooter as a pedestrian crash. I think that's the last that I heard. So it is a little bit hard to separate those out, whether or not they get, and depending on who's responding, it might get listed as a bicycle crash, like if they're on a bike lane or something like that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Commissioner Parsons.
Cynthia, could you really quickly maybe revisit the slide? You don't have to necessarily go back to it, but can you remind me? It seemed like 35-mile-an-hour roads were the ones that saw the most killed or seriously injured in Ann Arbor. And so I just want to clarify, if that is the case, right, then we need to address those. So I just wanted to have a little bit of more clarification, maybe that those are indeed the roads, and maybe for future meetings we can identify where those roads actually exist in Ann Arbor, and then try to figure out some solutions to them.
Yeah, you're recalling correctly that when the highest number of occurrences occurred on 35-mile-per-hour streets, and when you look at when you look at our speed limit map, and you look at the crash map, and you look at the tier 1 and the heat maps that we're producing in the tier 1 and the tier 2 safety locations that are as part of that package from the transportation plan, they are that's consistent, and that's also something that will be part of that Vision Zero implementation plan that we're going to be putting together this year.
Thank you so much. It looks like we are set with questions and feedback, and then I'll look forward to the final version of the report in October, and we'll get to dig into this data a bit more. And I think you're not done with us yet, though. So next up, we have a conversation. Let's see, Cynthia Redinger and Lieutenant Mike Sherba are going to facilitate a fatal crash review discussion with the commission. And what this I'm going to just sort of contextualize a little bit. At our last meeting, we talked specifically about the recent fatal scooter crash. And we had a lot of questions about sort of how information from a serious crash like that feeds into the city's engineering thoughts. And it seemed, as we were talking about how to continue this discussion, it seemed like sort of zooming out a level would be really valuable. So tonight, rather than focusing on that specific crash, what we're going to do is talk about, in general, the process with those serious crashes, how that information feeds into engineering, and how we can better learn from and adapt in response to those crashes. I hope that's more or less what you expected to be talking about tonight, but just for the rest of the commission to have that context.
Yeah, and Commissioner Kleiman, you stole my thunder. I was going to give the context and then turn it over. But I think what we thought we would do, we brainstormed a little bit on this the other day. We thought Lieutenant Sherba, it would be helpful to hear from him first to talk about when their crash scene investigators get on the scene. They look at multiple things, including kind of environmental conditions and engineering kind of conditions out there as well. And then you also just heard from, Cynthia about the crash report and some of the things that we look at the big picture as well. And, where we'd like to conclude is talk about how we are planning to move forward with the discussion. So what I'd like to do is turn over to Lieutenant Sherba and give him the mic to, talk about what that crash scene investigation looks like from a PD standpoint.
Thanks, Raymond. I wanted to give a little kind of a Reader's Digest version of what a crash investigation even looks like and how it starts and things like that. Essentially, it typically starts with somebody calling 911. to report an accident somewhere. Sometimes it's one of the parties involved. Sometimes it's a witness, a bystander, business owner who sees it out the window, etc. That's how it kind of gets the ball rolling. And one of the questions that the dispatcher always asks, the first question is, are there any injuries? And sometimes it's not known, but sometimes on something serious, or if it appears to be serious, the response will be, it looks bad, the cars are pretty mashed up, etc. So in that case, we have, in any case, there'll be an officer dispatched to the scene to start an investigation. And when the officer does the assessment, first thing obviously we want to make sure is, is anyone injured, and we need to get help if that's the case. If it's significant or appears it could be significant, a supervisor will be called to the scene, and the supervisor kind of makes the call, does this need a crash team member? And we've got a policy that essentially says that member of the APD traffic crash investigation team will be called out to any crash that may result in serious injury or death. And a serious injury is defined as a wound that may lead to death or have a life-altering effect. So even if it looks like it's going that way, we'll have the crash team come out. There may be a member of the crash team who's already working. A lot of times there's not. We do have, right now we have 8 people on the crash team plus a supervisor. 5 of them are crash reconstructionists and 3 are investigators. And kind of the delineation is, how much accident investigation training have they received? And it starts with every officer that we have has a basic crash investigation training. And then from there, there's AI1, AI2, I think through all the way through AI9. And then beyond that, it becomes reconstruction. So again, we've got 5 trained reconstructionists and 3 investigators on the crash team right now. That's, again, if we have somebody on working already, that's great. They can get there quickly. If not, the sergeant who's dispatched to the crash will call our supervisor of the crash team, who's Sergeant Chris Garrett, and he will ensure that at least two of the crash investigators and or reconstructionists are sent to the location. Sometimes that takes a little bit to get somebody there. Sometimes it's the middle of the night, but we try to get there as quick as we can, and we hold down the scene until the investigator is on scene. Once there, first thing to do is after obviously aids rendered to anyone who's injured, photographs. We want to get pictures of everything as it is, where it is, before anything is moved, if at all possible. There's also a field sketch that takes place during that time to kind of accurately mark where everything is, again, before it gets moved. At that time, the investigating officer is also doing an assessment, looking at weather, roadway conditions, time of day, lighting conditions, any idiosyncrasies that are noted, line of sight issues, overhanging vegetation. Basically anything that the investigator believes may have contributed to the crash is noted at that time. So we try to capture everything right on scene to get the best account of what exactly happened. Then comes interviews with the drivers, any passengers, and any witnesses before they're released from the scene. And then this includes potential for any investigation for impairment, whether it be alcohol or drugs, by any of the drivers involved. The team does have access to basically it's a GPS-based crash investigative tool. It's called Leica, L-E-I-C-A. I think that's more or less the brand name of it, but it's a device that recreates the scene by taking precise measurements via laser of the roadway, the curbs, debris, gouge marks, skid marks from the tires, any evidence that may be left behind, vehicle parts that are in the roadway, things like that. Those points allow the investigators to obtain like a scale drawing of the crash scene, and then eventually we'll make an accurate recreation via a picture of the scene. Prior to leaving the scene, all the vehicles are impounded and taken to a facility for storage. At the facility, there'll be constructionists do a workup on the vehicles. They do measurements of the damage. They compare those to the photographs, interior, exterior. Always take a picture from the driver's seat to document the view that the driver would have had during the crash. This documents any vision obstructions, maybe something hanging from the mirror or something like that, that may have been a factor. Most vehicles, and I forget which year this started. I know that there are some as old as like early 2000s have what's called an EDR, which is an event data recorder that's inside the vehicle. This black box, as we call it, it records information from any kind of serious event. Primarily, one of the primary things is an airbag deployment. The investigators have access to equipment that records the data from the vehicle, and then will give us a detailed printout of the event. The data shows a variety of information that includes like the speed of the vehicle up to 5 seconds before the crash or the airbag deployment. It measures acceleration, it measures braking, whether the seatbelt was used, steering angles, and other things that assist in the investigation. All that information is used to determine how and what caused the crash, which ultimately determines in the summary of the crash investigation report what the findings are, so to speak. And those findings are determine whether or not the investigator will seek charges through the county prosecutor, whether it be for misdemeanor violation charges being sought, a felony violation, or simply a civil infraction violation, or no violation. And that's kind of the Reader's Digest version of what a crash investigation looked like and what our crash team capabilities are at this time. And I'm happy to answer any questions. I know we went through it kind of fast.
Does it make sense to take questions now, or should we sort of continue through the next part and then?
You're the boss, Molly, whatever you want to do.
Well, I'll pause now, see if folks have questions, and if not, we can keep going. I am not seeing any questions. So was there also a piece then that was going to come from you, Cynthia, about the engineering side? Great.
Yeah. So when there's a serious crash and we have heard about it, what we will do typically is just double check our equipment and see if there's that first step is see if there's anything that's malfunctioning. A typical example of that is if something happens within the vicinity of an RFP, and checking, is it functioning? Is it communicating to all the units properly? Those are the types of steps that we take in a more immediate nature. And then the crash report, and looking at those more systemic type things are what we end up doing further along. But when we are doing those deep dives, we really do rely on the crash report and the information that is being put into that crash report to really help us understand what led to the crash.
Molly, one of the things that we discovered, we had a short meeting, Raymond and Cynthia and is it James Hill was the other gentleman, to kind of discuss, and Kayla was nice enough to facilitate that for us, to kind of discuss, are we doing everything we can to work collaboratively to get the information to engineering following a crash? And the answer was absolutely no, we're not. So we have, going forward, what we're going to do is, as part of the crash call out procedure, my crash sergeant is going to email Raymond at the any report of a significant crash where the investigators are called out. So he has a heads up that we had a crash here, there's an investigation that's ongoing, and then he can send his team out to take a look at things from an engineering standpoint. So that was not in place, but I think we were all in agreement that was a good idea, and kind of wondered why haven't we done this before? We don't know why we haven't done it before, but we're going to do it now.
That's great to hear. It seems like that kind of communication would really be an important piece of any sort of process that that would get developed about trying to create more of a feedback loop between those two groups. Commissioner Parsons.
I very much appreciate the detailed descriptions, and that helps tremendously. A couple things that maybe to ask or to comment on. One is that when we ask the question, is speed a factor? There's sort of two perspectives. Was speed a factor according to the speed limit might not be as relevant as was speed a factor in the injury or the fatality that occurred. And I'm thinking of a couple of the pedestrian accidents that we had just 2 years ago, I think, where cars were traveling within the speed limit at 35 miles an hour, but it still resulted in a fatality. Was speed a factor? From the enforcement perspective, it was not, but from the human perspective, it was. So I'm wondering if we can include in some of these reports just what the data finds. What was the speed of the vehicle that was traveling? And to loop it back into the specific incident that sort of prompted this discussion, how fast was that moped traveling when it struck or was struck by an SUV? Because I think speed is a determining factor in all of these. So it might be nice to track. I don't know how feasible that might be. Second thing to say, and I think this relates back to the comment which Cynthia had brought up before with the data, that 35 mile an hour speed zones are where our most critical accidents seem to be occurring on the most frequent basis. And, just a reminder, according to Vision Zero, if you're at 30 miles an hour, it's still a 50-50 chance that somebody's going to die if they're a pedestrian or on a bicycle. At 40 miles an hour, it's like a 90% chance. So like the speed factor, it's really important, I think, as we, it's not, I would like to see us collect the data just based on speed, not necessarily make the assessment on whether it was legal to be going that speed in that speed zone, if that makes sense. And maybe you could sort of comment on that. And thank you for what you're doing. I really appreciate it.
Commissioner Boland.
Yeah, so I love what's going on with the links between the officers taking the crash reports and engineering. I think that's really important, and oftentimes there's a really clear engineering solution that can be developed. But I'm also wondering about other E's and like education and changes in the way that things are enforced. What are some of the others? Encouragement, just kind of if it ever becomes apparent that we need to change sort of the transportation culture in Ann Arbor, and we don't have a team of education experts, as far as I know, to help us with that the way we have a team of engineers. And I just wonder if people are thinking about that, and if that ever comes up as a need that we should try to address.
I think that to answer your question, that we do have periodically, I know I just got the information from the state. There are 2 grants. One's a pedestrian bicyclist safety grant, pedestrian bicyclist seatbelt grant, and the other one is an OWI grant. And that's something that actually the county is going to administer, and AAPD is committed to participate in. And we will identify locations where we will do educational and then enforcement activity. So I think that touches on a little bit what you were asking. So there is that component. And then a little bit as well on our website and the C-Click Fix, we do get traffic problems that come in, and we do specific enforcement in those areas when we get information that reports from the citizens that there's a problem or a area that needs more attention. So there is some of that goes on. We do not, as you indicated, have like a team of experts to identify these things. We're more like, say, complaint driven a lot of times to identify those locations, but it does occur.
Thank you.
If I could just add to Lieutenant Sherba's statement, I think he's right on point. We are working on the update to our bicycle-friendly community application. For those who know, this is a designation given by the League of American Bicyclists. It's good for several years. I want to say upwards of 5 years. We're currently at silver. We're hoping to attain gold. The highest designation is platinum. There are only 3 or 4 communities in the country that have attained that. But I will say, they structure their application around the 5 E's, and education is a big part of that. And it is something that is a little lacking in our application, admittedly. The community as a whole only has 1 league cycling instructor. And there is an opportunity for us, not just as a city, but as a community, to really kind of bolster up some of that education. And so I'll just put out a plug to anybody who's watching. It's something we need to kind of work up our skill set within the city itself, but then we're always looking for partners too that can help us get the word out, that can be community educators, that have connections with populations that may be at risk. So, give me a holler if anyone's interested in partnering on that.
Thanks. Commissioner Parsons, I can't tell if your hand is up again or it's just still there. All right.
Sorry, previous. I'm good.
Okay. I wasn't sure if you had more questions. All right. I'm not seeing any other hands. Thank you both very much for this presentation. I really appreciate the thought and effort that's going into the way that we're approaching these crashes as a city. So this was really helpful. Thank you. Let's see what is next. We already did advisory bike lanes. So next up is the staff report. So we got a staff report providing project updates with agenda materials and Legistar, and Raymond is going to give us some highlights.
Very good. I dragged the wrong. There it is. I'm just shifting it so that I'm looking at the screen when I'm talking to you, even though that's failing to be folly right now, or proving to be folly. Okay, well, now it's missing. Bear with me for just a moment. My computer is having technical difficulties as it's trying to find Adobe. Oh, it's really maddening. Okay, let me shut the program down and restart it. Sorry, folks.
These things happen. If you don't have Healthy Streets in there, I don't know if you want to give us a very brief Healthy Streets update.
I can. It is in there, but that is, if I can walk and chew gum at the same time, that'll be a good thing for me to highlight. So, Healthy Streets is behind schedule. I'm sure that is not lost on any of you. We ran into a very unsatisfactory explanation for why it's delayed, which is contracting and insurance certification nightmare. So what happened, when council awards a contract or approves a contract, then there's a lot of behind the scenes that happens with executing that contract. A big part of that is checking their insurance certificates to make sure they're on par with what city expectations are. And then once that gets cleared, the contract is routed for signature. So all of that was underway, and we were making good progress on it shortly after council approved the contract. And then the prime contractor, which is PK, was acquired by another company. And that meant there was a name change, and that meant all of their insurance certifications had to be recertified because there's a new company that holds those insurance certificates. And the reason why this is particularly frustrating is PK is currently under contract on other jobs, either as a prime or a subcontractor. but it just threw us into a bit of a tailspin and has caused a lot more delay than we as staff are not very excited about. So anyway, the good news is we did get notice to proceed issued yesterday, I think it was. So the contract is, all the insurance certifications have been cleared now. The contract is being routed for final signatures as we speak. And we're hoping for deployment to happen like very soon. I want to say immediately or imminently, but I don't want to jinx it. So I'm hoping that, you know, by next week, you're going to start seeing the neighborhood slow streets popping up. That's kind of the direction I've given Cyrus Nahidi, who's the project manager on it, that, you know, those are barricades. Those can go up as soon as possible, as soon as POCO is available. POCO is a subcontractor under PK. And then some of the stuff that requires lane striping and things like that on Main and Packard, you know, if that comes a little bit later, that's fine, but we want that as soon as possible too. So it is in the works. And I know that's not entirely satisfactory, but that is just the unfortunate scenario and the hand we were dealt. So, all right. Yeah, apparently my Adobe crashed because it will not open it up again. But the good news is we have a Word version. I will work off of that. So on the annual street resurfacing project, there's been a lot of work that's happened. Work continues on the second phase of Canterbury, Chesterfield, Cranbrook, Dorchester, Manchester, and Towner. And the first phase of the Packard asphalt path repaving was done. The second phase of the Burr Park and Colony Road is scheduled to begin and probably is underway already this week. South Industrial, there is just an update on the timeline. The hope is that that'll be done by probably end of August. I was down on Industrial today and it's still closed off. So probably mid-August is lost to us, but hopefully by the end of the month, it will be done.
Hey, Raymond, the concrete pours are supposed to be done this week, but then we'll be coming in to mill and pave the asphalt sections on the north and south ends as well. And we are hoping that all of that will be done by the end of August. So just to add a little context there.
Very good. All right. Fuller Court Sidewalk Gap Project. That project is now complete and will come off of future reports. Let's see. North Main Street Stormwater Project. This is going to replace a storm sewer pipe that previously went between two buildings. Construction's underway and has resulted in some lane closures, but those are expected to be removed by the end of this week or early next week. Creston Liberty Water Main Project, kind of a similar thing. This is water main, but it does have impacts to transportation because there is a lane closure on Crest between Liberty and Buena Vista. And then there's also on Liberty from Crest to South 7th Street as well. So again, it's not a transportation project, but it is affecting some of the traffic circulation out there. There is some language in there. I'm sure all of you are well aware of the kind of catastrophe that happened at Maple and Jackson when a 20-inch water main burst and kind of washed out some of the roadway. All of that work is now complete, and Maple is open back up to traffic.
With a bike lane added too, that wasn't there before.
Nice.
Side note.
State Street Improvement Project from William and Huron. This is led by the DDA, but it's a joint project with the city that's going to include resurfacing, water main work, non-motorized improvements, and streetscaping. Project is scheduled to begin in 2022. For Miller and Catherine, kind of a similar timeline. Construction is anticipated to begin in spring of 2022 as well. Platt and Earhart Road. The big thing to note here is that public engagement meeting is planned for September. And maybe Kayla, when we have a date certain on that, we should send that to the Transportation Commission so they're aware of that opportunity. Similarly, for 7th Street and Greenview, kind of at the southern end of 7th Street, there is public engagement that is also going to be scheduled for September as well. Both of those projects, both 7th and Platt, are scheduled for 2022 construction. Broadway Street from Plymouth to Plymouth. Sounds like a point, not a length or segment, but it is. Design work on that project is underway, and public engagement is also being planned for September. That too will be a construction 2022 project. Newport Sunset Sidewalk Gap Project. The big thing to note here, the big update was that there was a virtual public engagement meeting that was held earlier this month, last week. And the summary of the meeting will be posted online shortly, and there is a project website for that. We just talked about healthy streets. For Lower Town Mobility Study, I did want to highlight that there are a series of office hours that are being held on this. The next one is on Friday, on the 20th of August, and then there will be a 4th office hour on September 3rd. These are short one hour-ish meetings that allow us to kind of have an informal conversation with the public. There will be one final public big meeting in September where the final recommendations will be revealed. And then the transportation is expected to get a presentation on Lower Town in September or possibly October as well. Under MDOT coordination, M14 has been kind of a hot topic lately, so a couple things I wanted you to be aware of. MDOT is currently conducting a road safety audit. Road safety audit is a process whereby transportation professionals kind of go through and assess the safety conditions of a roadway or intersection. And so that is being spearheaded by MDOT and involves a private consultant, but they've also engaged the city, engineering department, fire department, and others. We still haven't seen the final report, but that's due out here before too long. The other thing I'll notice, MDOT does have a series of interim measures that they plan to install. The first is a queue warning signage, which pretty much will alert motorists that I believe are eastbound. If there's a backup on M14, there'll be a sign alerting motorists of that backup so that they know to be prepared to stop. And then the other thing that they're planning on doing is later this fall installing high friction surface because there have been crashes near the Barton interchange. The hope is that the high friction surface will keep vehicles from losing control, especially maybe during rain events or things like that. There are updated numbers under the streetlight implementation, so you can see those there. Traffic calming, a couple things to note. Longman and Fairview, the initial questionnaire is complete, and it looks like there is enough support for the process to proceed. And the same thing holds true for Northside Avenue. Both of those questionnaires were completed late last month, early this month, and so we're kind of advanced to step 2 of the process, or I'm sorry, step 3 of the process, where we start to engage and come up with ideas. The last one that's in the queue for now is Granger from Packard to State. That one is on hold for the moment while we get a head start on Longman and Northside, but that process will kind of ramp up here before too long on Granger. And then I believe the last update is under the transportation plan. We have released an RFP, a request for proposals, for a consultant to help us with a Vision Zero action plan or implementation strategy. The idea here is that, the transportation plan is, the ink is still drying, it's fresh off the presses. We're super excited about it, but it's very big. It's very, it's hard for us to kind of figure out exactly what will have the most impact in the very short term. So we're having a consultant help us really figure out where we can have the most impactful change, especially related to Vision Zero, out of all the strategies that are identified in the plan. What are the things that we can do in the next 5 to 6 years to really meet our metrics in terms of, creating an all ages and abilities bike network, how we can reduce crashes, how we can kind of address a lot of those goals that are identified in the plan. I'm happy to report too that Commissioner Boland is on the selection committee for that, and we have some other external partners as well as internal reviewers that are going to be part of that review panel for selecting the consultant. So stay tuned for that. I'm sure we'll be reporting to you regularly once that gets kicked off. The hope is to move pretty fast on that, just so you know, because we want to start implementing, probably in the spring. The days are quickly getting away from us for fall implementation, but we want to, look at the data, come up with a strategy that's impactful, and hit the ground running in the spring. And I think this will really help us do that. So you'll be hearing a lot of updates on this space in the future. And I believe that those are the highlights that I wanted to discuss, and I'm happy to entertain any questions you might have.
Great, thank you so much. Not seeing any questions. So we will move on to, Commissioner Parsons. There you are. Yep. Uh-oh, you've lost audio.
Am I here now? Okay, sorry, guys, sorry. Raymond, thanks for the update. A couple quick thoughts, and maybe we can go through them. Two thoughts, really, and then we can go through them, and maybe I can ask, and then you can answer. One is that I internally was questioning whether or not Healthy Streets was worth putting out at this point, this late in the summer. But then I also realized, hey, we have this Delta variant, and we also have schools opening again. And so while Healthy Streets is a great framing, I'm also wondering if Safe Streets is a way to think about this. And if there's a way to sort of frame it for the public that these are still important aspects, because I would like to see them to go through. So I don't know if there's been internal discussion or you guys have thought about that, or we could, discuss it. Maybe a quick answer to that one, and then the follow-up with Silo Church.
Yeah, so I think, we as staff still see value in the Healthy Streets initiative for the reasons that you just cited. Obviously school, both the university as well as Ann Arbor Public Schools are coming back in session. And so providing people with, good connections and bicycle, pedestrian and active forms of transportation options is important. COVID aside, those do align with our 820 carbon neutrality goal plans as well as the transportation plan goals. So there's definitely merit in the program, regardless of what's happening with COVID. And as you cited, COVID is still here if you haven't seen it. So, I think there is some validity in it. We are disappointed that we didn't roll it out earlier. Sure. We had all hoped that was going to be the case. For what it's worth, it looks like it will be deployed about the same duration as last year. You may recall that things got deployed right around Labor Day last year, and we might get a week or so head start on it, but it's going to be similar to last year's deployment. In terms of kind of rebranding the initiative to Safe Streets, I see where you're coming from with it. I don't necessarily disagree with the sentiment. I think for now, we'll probably just stay the course, just because there's been a lot of, when we talk about Healthy Streets, people seem to know what it is we're talking about and know where to go to get more information. But I think where I'd really like to pivot off of what your point is, moving forward in the future, my preference is to really look at permanent solutions that do address the safety. And so, whether we call that initiative Safe Streets and look to do quick build deployments and more permanent solutions and less of the kind of moving barricades and barrels around, I think that would be something that as staff we're kind of interested in, and this implementation strategy I think is going to really help us figure out what we can have the most impact with and what we can get the most bang for our bucks with.
Well, I super appreciate that. The second question is on Silo Church that didn't make it into this update. And there was a communication from Pete Hook and communication with Jane Allen, basically saying it's too late to include medians into the project design, and trying to deal with unsafe vehicular movements into the sort of center lane that are used as passing lanes. I'm just wondering, it's not in the project update, so I wonder how much time we actually do have. If there's ways to, I don't know, tweak that a little bit, because I think that that Mr. Hook's comments are absolutely valid in terms of what I see happening a lot on the road diets that we do, where cars are using that center lane as a passing lane in a really dangerous fashion. And so, you know, you can see the writing on the wall with how Scioto Church is designed, that people could abuse it. And so the more, you know, barriers that we can put up and preventative measures, RFBs potentially. So I was wondering where that specific project is within these updates, and if there's still time.
I can field that. The Scioto Church project we have suffered some ongoing delays in getting that. I mean, honestly, we were expecting it was going to be built by now. That obviously has not happened at this point. We just had a meeting on this earlier today. It's realistically, we're not going to get it bid out through MDOT until November. So there's not going to be any construction happening this year anyway. As a follow-up to the last conversation we had on there, we did talk to MDOT, and Cynthia, she's not on the call anymore, but she, in part of the discussion, we were able to add RFBs to those crosswalks. So that'll be a big improvement there. I know the project team looked at islands at some point. I don't think it was practical, or it wasn't feasible to fit them in due to turning movements and things like that, and conflicting with turning movement, is my understanding. So, but it does look like we're going to include our RFBs in that.
That's great news. Thank you. Thank you.
Sure.
Being cognizant of time, I'm going to move us along. If people have further questions, we can always reach out to Raymond directly. But thank you so much for the update. Next up, we've got liaison reports. So any commissioners who specifically serve as a liaison to another body or organization are invited to provide brief reports and updates. Commissioner Smith.
Good evening, everyone. Just wanted to let you know that we are planning on coming back to full service this at the end of the month. We have our bid up, and our drivers will be bidding next weekend. So we are still looking at a driver shortage. And as I mentioned last commission meeting, we're making contingency plans for that. And we may at this point need to use some of those, but we're looking to impact the least number of people, the least amount. And we'll have more details on that as we get closer to August 29th. But we are looking forward to bringing back the majority of our service and trying to get back to normal. The other note would be that the federal government, the FDA, well, actually DOT has extended the mask requirement through January. So we will continue to require masks through that time.
Great. That's terrific news. Thank you. I'm not seeing any other liaison reports, so we can move on to commission member communications. This is a chance for all commissioners to provide reports and updates. Not surprised it's a little quiet. It's a small group of us today in August. Next up is call for agenda items. As usual, if you have agenda items, this is just a chance to briefly tell us what they are, and we'll dig into the details separate from this meeting. All right, moving right along. So at this point, if there are no objections, we will adjourn the August 18th meeting. I'm going to pause and look for objections. Not seeing any. This meeting is adjourned. It's great to see you all. Thank you all. Have a good night.